Hello everyone, I am the Boring Historian, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The morning light filtered through the small, high window of Metrodora's cubicle in the lupanar of Regio 2, casting thin beams across the stone bed with its thin, stained mattress. At 23, she had spent nearly 7 years in this cramped cell, servicing Rome's endless appetite for pleasure. Born in Greece and sold into slavery after her father's debts mounted beyond recovery, Metrodora's story was common among the women who worked in Rome's numerous brothels. She rose, wincing at the soreness that never truly left her body, and reached for the small copper basin where she kept water for her morning ablutions. The previous night had been busy. A festival day always brought more clients, more coins for her dominus, and more bruises to hide beneath the bright makeup that marked her profession. As dawn broke across the eternal city, Metrodora and thousands like her prepared for another day of commodified intimacy. This is their story, not just of the sexual transactions that defined their official purpose, but of the complex, often brutal reality that filled the hours between clients. What did these women, mostly enslaved and rarely remembered by history, actually do during their daily existence? How did they survive, find moments of agency, build relationships, and navigate a society that simultaneously demanded their services while marking them with permanent infamia? Rome, 75 CE. The Subura district stirred to life as the first light touched the uppermost floors of the insulae. Within the narrow streets of this crowded neighborhood, a 3-story building stood at the intersection of 2 alleyways. Unlike the shops that advertised their wares openly, this establishment maintained a relatively discreet exterior, marked only by a small phallus carved above the doorway, a symbol understood by all Romans as an indicator of the services provided within. Inside, 14 women and 3 men began their daily routines. In a small room on the ground floor, Demetria, a 50-year-old former prostitute who now managed the brothel's daily operations for its wealthy owner, lit an oil lamp and began reviewing the previous day's earnings. The bronze coins, mostly asses with a few sestertii from wealthier clients, were counted meticulously and recorded on a wax tablet. Upstairs, in cells barely large enough for their stone beds, the women of the lupanarium woke to another day. While Rome's elite might luxuriate in lengthy morning rituals attended by personal slaves, the prostitutes' morning ablutions were functional and hurried. Metrodora dabbed at her face with a damp cloth, wincing as she touched a bruise left by a drunken client. Like her colleagues, she had learned to cleanse herself efficiently with minimal water. A larger establishment might have its own latrine, but this modest brothel required its occupants to use the public facilities down the street. Going there would be one of her first tasks of the day, though she would wait until the acquarioli, water boys employed by the brothel, had fetched fresh water for washing. "Hurry up in there," came a voice from outside her cubicle. "Demetria says we have early customers waiting." Metrodora sighed. Coming, Tice. She quickly applied a layer of white lead makeup to cover the bruise, added rouge to her cheeks and lips, and lined her eyes with kohl. The cosmetics were provided by the establishment, necessary tools of the trade. Her long dark hair was already styled in the elaborate curls favored by clients, arranged the previous evening and preserved by sleeping carefully. Restyling daily would have been impractical. She slipped into her tunic, brightly colored to identify her profession, and added a gauzy overlay that revealed more than it concealed. Unlike respectable Roman matrons who wore stolas and covered their bodies completely, Prostitutes were required by law to wear distinctive clothing that marked their status. Metrodora added a pair of gilded anklets that jingled when she walked, another signifier of her trade. By the time she emerged, several of the other women were already in the main receiving area, where early morning clients, often workers stopping in before their day began, waited to make their selections. The brothel operated nearly around the clock, though the busiest periods came during midday when the city took its break for lunch and in the evenings after dinner. Demetria assessed each woman with a critical eye. "You," she pointed to Lucia, a young Gallic woman who had arrived only months before. "Your eyes are red. Were you crying again? Fix it before any customers see you." The girls knew better than to protest or explain. Showing distress was bad for business, and what happened to them during their service was irrelevant to the establishment's needs. The only thing that mattered was appearing desirable and available. As the first clients entered, Metrodora assumed the pose and expression expected of her, a practiced smile that suggested eagerness while masking any genuine emotion. The day's work had begun. The financial structure of Roman prostitution was primarily built around exploitation. For enslaved women like Metrodora, earnings went directly to their owners. The prices were standardized and posted, typically between 2 and 16 asses per encounter, with the average being around 2 asses. This placed sexual services within reach of most working Romans, as even day laborers typically earned at least a denarius, 16 asses, daily. On this particular morning, as the early clients made their selections, Demetria sat near the entrance, collecting payment before each transaction. A small wooden board hung near her stool, with each woman's name or descriptor and her price. Some establishments used tokens that clients would purchase and then give to their chosen prostitute, but this smaller operation worked on direct cash transactions. 2 asses, Demetria stated flatly to a young man eyeing Metrodora. "Pay first." The youth handed over the coins, which Demetria bit to test their metal before depositing them in a leather pouch. She made a mark on her tablet next to Metrodora's name and nodded toward the stairs. For women who had managed to purchase their freedom, or who had been born free but fallen into prostitution through necessity, the financial arrangements might differ slightly. They could potentially keep a portion of their earnings, though they still paid substantial fees to the brothel owner for protection and the use of the facilities. These independent contractors were rare in brothels, but more common among the higher-class courtesans who operated from their own apartments. The brothel owner, Marcus Lucius Fronto, visited only occasionally to collect profits and inspect his investment. A former soldier who had invested his military savings in several commercial ventures, he owned 2 brothels and a tavern. The daily management he left to Demetria, whose decades of experience in the trade made her valuable despite her age. Her compensation came in the form of a small percentage of the daily earnings, free lodging in a back room of the establishment, and the security of knowing she wouldn't end her days begging on the streets, the fate of many former prostitutes who had no family to support them in old age. By mid-morning, most of the women had already served multiple clients. The turnover was rapid. Most encounters lasted no more than 15 minutes. Efficiency was essential to profitability. Clients were expected to wash briefly at a basin provided outside the cells before and after their visit, though many neglected this courtesy. During slower periods, the women were assigned other tasks, cleaning the establishment, mending clothing, or assisting the 2 elderly female slaves who prepared the simple meals provided to the brothel's residents. No moment of their time was considered their own. For Metrodora, this morning had brought 4 clients before the sun had fully risen above the city's hills. Between them, she had barely enough time to rinse herself with water from a small basin kept beside her bed and straighten the thin mattress. The physical toll was considerable, but showing fatigue would only invite punishment from Demetria, whose primary concern was maintaining the brothel's reputation for attractive, compliant women. As the morning progressed, a fifth client, a merchant from Alexandria, purchased Metrodora's services for a full hour, paying 8 asses for the extended time. Such longer bookings were welcome for the brief respite they provided from the constant turnover, though they often came with expectations of more elaborate services. "You're lucky," whispered Ties as they passed in the narrow hallway. "My last one smelled like he hadn't bathed in a month. At least yours looks clean." Such small mercies constituted fortune in their world. The merchant was indeed clean, soft-spoken, and not inclined toward the rougher behaviors that many clients exhibited. For Metrodora, it was as good an outcome as she could hope for on any given day. Contrary to popular imagination, Roman prostitutes did not spend every waking moment engaged in sexual transactions. The rhythm of the brothel followed patterns dictated by the city's daily life, with certain hours bringing greater or lesser client traffic. The midday period, when many Romans took their prandium, lunch, and a brief rest, typically brought a surge of customers to the brothels. But in the late afternoon, there often came a lull before the evening rush began after cena, dinner. During these quieter intervals, the women's time was still considered the property of the establishment, and idleness was not permitted. After her appointment with the Alexandrian merchant concluded, Metrodora was granted a brief break to eat. The meal was simple: a bowl of bean porridge, a piece of coarse bread, and watered wine. Nutritional but barely palatable, it was designed to maintain the women's health and appearance at minimal cost. "Metrodora, when you're finished eating, Demetria wants you to help with the new girl," said Primus, one of the male slaves who served as both porter and protector for the establishment. The new girl was Yulia, recently purchased at a slave market after her previous owner, a wealthy widow, had died. Unlike many brothel slaves who had been raised in captivity or sold into sexual slavery at a young age, Yulia had served as a household slave until her 13th year. The transition to her new role had been traumatic, and she had attempted to flee twice in her first week, earning beatings that had temporarily diminished her value. Metrodora found her sitting on the edge of her stone bed, staring blankly at the wall. At perhaps 14 years old, Yulia's face still carried the softness of childhood, though her eyes had already acquired the distant gaze common to those in their profession. "You need to eat," Metrodora said, placing a bowl beside the girl. "If you don't keep your strength up, it only gets worse." Yulia turned slowly, her expression unchanged. "I won't be here long enough for it to matter. My uncle will come for me. He promised my mother he would always look after me if anything happened." Metrodora had heard similar hopes from many new girls over the years. Some clung to the belief that family members would rescue them, that lovers would purchase their freedom, or that they would somehow escape their circumstances through some stroke of fortune. Reality rarely fulfilled such dreams. "Until then," Metrodora said gently, "you must survive. And that means eating, keeping clean, and learning how to protect yourself as much as possible." The afternoon hours brought various tasks. Some women were sent to stand in doorways along busier streets, advertising the brothel's services to passers-by, though they remained under the watchful eye of a male guard to prevent escape attempts. Others mended clothing, washed linens, or assisted with preparing the establishment for the busy evening ahead. Metrodora was assigned to help Demetria prepare new cosmetics grinding minerals and mixing them with animal fat to create the makeup all the women were required to wear. Her Greek literacy, unusual among the brothel's residents, also made her valuable for maintaining simple records and occasionally reading messages or documents for Demetria, whose own literacy was limited. "The owner will visit tomorrow," Demetria informed her as they worked. "He's bringing a potential buyer for ties. Make sure everyone knows to be at their best." The sale of women between brothels or to private buyers was common. For the women themselves, such transfers might mean better or worse conditions, but rarely freedom. Ties had been at the brothel for nearly 5 years, longer than most, and at 26 was considered approaching the end of her prime earning years in this lower-tier establishment. "Does Ties know?" Metrodora asked quietly. Demetria shrugged. "What difference does it make? It's not her decision." As she continued mixing rouge, Metrodora considered her own future. At 23, she likely had a few more years before she too would be sold to a less prestigious establishment, or perhaps, if she were fortunate, to a private owner who might eventually grant her freedom in exchange for continued sexual access. Some former prostitutes managed to establish themselves as hairdressers, seamstresses, or small-scale traders if they gained their freedom with a small peculium savings. Others became maidens themselves, perpetuating the system that had exploited them. The afternoon progressed with a steady trickle of clients. A group of young men celebrating a friend's coming-of-age visited, their boisterous laughter echoing through the narrow hallways as they pooled their money to purchase his first sexual experience. 2 married merchants conducting business in Rome stopped in, their conversation about trade continuing casually as they selected women. A regular client, an elderly baker who visited weekly, arrived with his usual small gift of honeyed bread for his preferred girl, a rare kindness in the transactional atmosphere. Between clients, the women found moments for small personal rituals. Lucia quietly sang songs from her homeland when she thought no one was listening. An older woman named Briseis applied a poultice of herbs to her chronically painful knee. 2 younger women practiced a dice game using knucklebones, betting with pebbles rather than coins they didn't possess. These fleeting expressions of individuality and humanity persisted despite the system designed to reduce them to commodities. In these quiet moments between transactions, the women reclaimed fragments of identity beyond their commercial purpose. Roman prostitution existed in a society without modern medicine or effective contraception. Managing health concerns was a constant preoccupation for women whose bodies were their livelihood. In the brothel's back room, Demetria maintained a collection of remedies for the most common ailments that afflicted her charges. Prevention of pregnancy was a primary concern for both the women and the establishment. Unwanted pregnancies reduced profitability and created complications regarding the ownership of any resulting children. "Drink this?" Demetria instructed Lucia, handing her a bitter concoction. Every morning, without fail. The drink contained silphium, a now extinct plant that Romans believed prevented conception. Other contraceptive methods included pessaries made with acacia gum, wool soaked in vinegar, and various herbal preparations. Their effectiveness varied widely, and pregnancies still occurred despite these precautions. When they did, the outcomes were rarely positive. Abortion, though not illegal in Roman society, carried significant health risks. Some women survived multiple procedures, while others died from infections or hemorrhage. Those who carried pregnancies to term typically saw their infants taken from them. Male children might be raised to serve the establishment in various capacities, while female children would likely be groomed for the same work as their mothers once they reached puberty. Metrodora had experienced 2 pregnancies during her years in the brothel. The first had ended in a miscarriage after a particularly brutal client. The second had resulted in a daughter who had been sold at birth to a wealthy family seeking an additional household slave. The physical and emotional toll of these experiences marked her deeply, though she rarely spoke of them. Infectious diseases presented another constant threat. The Romans had no understanding of bacteria or viruses, but they recognized that certain conditions spread through sexual contact. Brothel workers suffered disproportionately from various ailments, from relatively minor infections to more serious diseases that could eventually prove fatal or render them unable to work. "Let me see," said Chloe, an older prostitute who had developed some skill in treating common conditions. She examined a rash on Metrodora's arm. "Put this on it morning and night," she advised, handing her a small pot of ointment made from olive oil, beeswax, and herbs, "and try to keep it dry." Chloe had accumulated her knowledge through years of necessity. Though Romans had physicians, professional medical care was rarely wasted on brothel slaves unless their condition threatened their value significantly. Instead, the women relied on folk remedies, experience passed between generations of sex workers, and occasional advice from clients with medical knowledge. Physical injuries were commonplace. Rough treatment by clients could result in bruises, cuts, or more serious harm. The stone beds with their thin mattresses caused chronic back and joint pain. The poor ventilation and constant exposure to lamp smoke in the small, windowless rooms led to respiratory issues. Mental health, though not conceptualized as it is today, suffered equally. Many women dissociated during sexual encounters, a psychological survival mechanism that ancient sources occasionally noted without understanding its cause. Depression, anxiety, and what might now be recognized as post-traumatic stress were common, though unnamed. Some sought escape through alcohol or opium when they could access these substances. Others developed obsessive behaviors or superstitions that gave them a sense of control in lives where they had almost none. Many placed particular importance on religious practices and divination, seeking meaning or hope from deities or fortune tellers. Metrodora, client, called Primus from the hallway, interrupting her brief respite. She quickly applied a bit more rouge to her cheeks, straightened her tunic, and prepared her practiced smile. The business of survival continued. As evening approached, the brothel's pace accelerated. The post-cena hours brought the day's heaviest traffic as men sought entertainment after their evening meal. Some came directly from dinner parties, still wearing their togas and carrying the scent of expensive perfumes. Others arrived from taverns, their judgment already compromised by wine. The brothel transformed for evening business. Additional oil lamps were lit, their flickering light both practical and atmospheric. Incense burned to mask less pleasant odors. A male slave stationed near the entrance played simple melodies on a reed pipe, creating a festive atmosphere. While formal Roman society excluded prostitutes from legitimate social standing, marking them with the permanent stain of infamia, the women created their own social networks and hierarchies within their marginalized world. In the brothel's main receiving room, where clients could drink wine and select their companions, a complex social ecosystem operated beneath the commercial transactions. Status among the women derived from various factors. Beauty and youth still ranked highest in their profession's values, but cleverness, skill at avoiding the worst clients, and ability to cultivate regular, gentler customers also conferred respect. Metrodora occupied a middle position in this informal hierarchy. Her Greek heritage and education gave her certain advantages, particularly with more cultured clients. Her literacy made her useful to Demetria and other women who couldn't read or write. Yet she had never mastered the political skills that might have elevated her to the top tier of even this limited society. That position belonged to Nevolia, a Roman-born woman who had entered prostitution after her father's execution for treason left the family destitute. At 25, she had spent 7 years in the profession, but maintained connections to free society through a cousin who sometimes visited her. More importantly, she had cultivated several wealthy regular clients who brought her gifts and requested her exclusively, allowing her more rest between encounters than the other women received. "Here," Nevolia said quietly, slipping Metrodora a small packet as they passed in the hallway. "For your arm. My merchant brought it from Egypt. He says it works better than the Roman remedies." Such small kindnesses created bonds among women who might otherwise have viewed each other solely as competition. While fights and jealousies certainly occurred, solidarity was equally common. New women were taught which clients to avoid if possible, how to manage difficult situations, and which guards might be persuaded to intervene if a customer became truly dangerous. The evening brought a diverse clientele. A group of young aristocrats arrived, loudly proclaiming their intentions and demanding to see all available women. Their spending power earned them priority, though their behavior caused Demetria to position Primus and another guard closer to the occupied rooms. "Not the new one," Metrodora whispered urgently to Demetria as one of the young men pointed toward Yulia. "They're too rough. She's not ready." Demetria hesitated, calculating potential profit against potential damage. "Fine," she conceded. "Tell her to stay in the back until they leave, but you take her place." Such small interventions constituted the limited protection more experienced women could offer newer ones. It wasn't kindness alone that motivated them. Damaged goods brought lower prices and created problems for everyone, but genuine empathy often played a part as well. As the evening progressed, the social connections extended beyond the brothel's residents. Regular clients developed relationships that, while fundamentally commercial, sometimes included elements of genuine human connection. Some visited as much for conversation and company as for sex, especially older men seeking attention they no longer received elsewhere. Lucius Aelius, a middle-aged scribe who visited weekly, spent most of his time with Metrodora simply talking about books he had read or copied. Knowing her background made her one of the few who might appreciate such discussions. He paid for the full hour regardless, though their physical interactions were brief and almost perfunctory. "I brought you something," he said on this visit, glancing around to ensure Demetria wasn't watching. He slipped a small scroll from his toga. "A copy of some new poems. Keep it hidden." Such gifts were technically the property of the brothel owner, but small items could sometimes be concealed. Metrodora had created a hiding place in her mattress, where she kept a few treasured possessions, now including this scroll she would read in stolen moments of privacy. The prostitutes' social world also included the various service providers who orbited their establishment, the food vendors who supplied their meals, the perfume sellers who provided their cosmetics, the clothing merchants who sold the revealing garments they wore. These interactions, though commercial, provided contact with the outside world and sometimes sources of information or small favors. As the evening reached its peak, a different type of visitor arrived. A woman named Agrippina, dressed in expensive fabrics but wearing the distinctive makeup of a prostitute, entered with her own guard. A former brothel worker who had managed to secure her freedom and establish herself as an independent courtesan, she occasionally visited her former workplace to recruit women whose contracts were ending or who might be purchased for the right price. "I need 2 girls for a private party tomorrow," she informed Demetria. Senators' sons. They pay well but expect quality. Such opportunities could be lucrative for the brothel, and occasionally provided women with chances to meet potential benefactors who might improve their circumstances. Demetria selected Nevolia and another of her more refined women for the assignment, negotiating a substantial fee that would be split between the brothel owner and Agrippina. These connections to higher tiers of sex work offered rare glimpses of potential advancement in a profession with few opportunities for upward mobility. Though most brothel workers would never achieve the relative independence of a courtesan, the possibility, however remote, provided something almost as valuable as the reality: hope. As the night deepened, the character of the brothel's clientele changed. The wealthy citizens who had arrived after dinner began to depart, replaced by workers from businesses that operated into the night. Bakers beginning their pre-dawn shifts, guards coming off duty, sailors newly arrived in port. The women who had been working since morning showed visible signs of exhaustion, their carefully applied makeup smudged, their practiced smiles growing stiff. Those who had received more difficult clients moved gingerly, hiding injuries that might reduce their desirability. 2 more hours, Demetria announced as she made her rounds. Make yourselves presentable. Final clients pay the same as first ones. In the small cell she called her own, Metrodora took advantage of a brief gap between appointments to quickly wash and reapply her makeup. The scroll from Lucius was safely hidden in her mattress, a small promise of escape through words when her body finally received its rest. She had served 11 clients since morning, a typical day's labor in a mid-tier urban brothel. The physical toll was considerable. Despite the Romans' emphasis on bathing and hygiene in other contexts, the rapid turnover in brothels made thorough cleaning between clients impractical. The women did what they could with limited water and time, but discomfort and irritation were constant companions. Final client of the night, announced Primus from her doorway. Metrodora adjusted her expression to one of welcome as a middle-aged man in a worker's tunic entered. The transaction proceeded efficiently. This late-night customer was clearly tired himself and not interested in prolonging the encounter. Within minutes he was gone, and Metrodora was finally permitted to end her workday. Night brought the closest approximation to privacy the women experienced. Though their cells remained without proper doors, the reduced activity allowed for a semblance of personal time. Some brothels operated continuously, requiring women to work in shifts, but this establishment permitted most of its residents a few hours of uninterrupted rest between the departure of the last evening clients and the arrival of the earliest morning visitors. In these precious hours, the women engaged in the small rituals that maintained their humanity. Metrodora carefully removed her makeup, using olive oil to dissolve the lead-based cosmetics before wiping them away with a cloth. She treated her various irritations and injuries with the remedies provided by Chloe and Nevolia. Finally, she retrieved the hidden scroll and, by the dim light of a small oil lamp, lost herself briefly in the words of a poet writing about freedom, nature, and beauty. Nearby, other women found their own means of reclaiming themselves from their commercial use. Lucia sang softly to herself, songs from her childhood in Gaul. 2 Syrian women spoke in their native language, sharing memories of home. Nevolia meticulously counted the small coins she had managed to hide away, her hope for eventual freedom. Sleep, when it came, was often disturbed. Nightmares plagued many of the women. The thin walls meant that sounds carried, a client arriving for one of the women assigned to night duty, the cries of another having a bad dream, the persistent cough of an older prostitute whose lungs had been damaged by years of exposure to lamp smoke in enclosed spaces. Yet even in these difficult conditions, the human capacity for adaptation allowed many to find sufficient rest to continue functioning. The body's need for sleep eventually overcame even the most distressing circumstances, providing temporary escape from their reality. As Metrodora drifted into slumber, her thoughts turned, as they often did, to memories of her childhood in Greece. The small olive grove behind her family's modest home, the sound of her father reciting Homer, the feeling of sun-warmed stone beneath her bare feet. These fragments of her past sustained her through the present's indignities and allowed her to imagine, however briefly, a different future. The following day brought a rare opportunity. It was the festival of Bona Dea, a celebration restricted to women, and Demetria had decided to allow most of her charges to attend the public portions of the ceremony. Such occasional participation in religious activities served multiple purposes. It maintained the women's connection to broader society, demonstrated the brothel's adherence to Roman religious norms, and provided a controlled opportunity for the women to leave the establishment without significant risk of escape. "Stay together," Demetria instructed as she assembled the group in the early morning. "Primus and Titus will accompany you. Anyone who attempts to flee will be severely punished." Despite these threats and the presence of guards, the opportunity to leave the brothel's confines generated palpable excitement. The women had been permitted to wear slightly more modest clothing than their usual working attire, still identifiable as prostitutes, but not as overtly provocative. As they walked through the streets toward the temple, Metrodora observed the city coming to life around them. Shopkeepers arranging their wares, children running errands, matrons supervising household slaves carrying goods from the market, the ordinary patterns of Roman life from which they were largely excluded. Religion offered prostitutes one of the few legitimate connections to mainstream society. Though their infamia prevented them from participating in certain religious roles and ceremonies, many cults and deities remained accessible to them. Some even developed particular significance within prostitute communities. At the temple of Bona Dea, the women took their place at the margins of the gathering. The more respectable matrons kept their distance, but the priestesses did not turn them away. The ceremony itself, focused on a goddess associated with chastity and healing, might have seemed ironically inappropriate for prostitutes, but many found personal meaning in the rituals, despite this contradiction. "I always ask her for protection from disease," whispered Lucia as they watched the proceedings. "My mother said Bona Dea listens even to women like us." For many prostitutes, religion provided psychological resources their circumstances otherwise denied them. A sense of control through prayers and offerings, hope for divine intervention, and spiritual explanations for their suffering. While elite Romans might engage with religion through philosophical contemplation, those at society's margins often embraced its most mystical and practical aspects. Venus, unsurprisingly, held special significance for many sex workers, though their relationship with the goddess of love and beauty was complex. Some viewed her as a patron deity of their profession. Others prayed to her for beauty that might attract gentler clients, or even a benefactor who could purchase their freedom. Beyond the official state religion, prostitutes often participated in mystery cults and foreign religious practices that had established footholds in Rome. The cults of Isis, Cybele, and Mithras attracted followers from society's margins, offering spiritual systems where personal devotion might matter more than social standing. During their supervised excursion, Metrodora noticed a small shrine to Isis along their route. When the guards were momentarily distracted, she quickly placed a small flower she had picked on the shrine and whispered a brief prayer. "What did you ask for?" Thais inquired quietly as they continued walking. "Not what," Metrodora replied. "Who? I always pray for my daughter on festival days." These personal religious practices provided rare opportunities for prostitutes to express individual identity and agency. While their bodies were commodified and controlled, their private spiritual lives remained somewhat their own, though even these were shaped by the harsh realities of their existence. After the public ceremony concluded, the women were permitted a brief visit to a nearby food vendor before returning to the brothel. Such small pleasures, selecting their own meal rather than receiving whatever was provided, sitting outdoors in the sunshine, conversing without the immediate pressure of work, constituted rare freedom. As they walked back toward the brothel, Metrodora found herself alongside Yulia, who had remained mostly silent throughout the excursion. "The ceremony was beautiful," the young woman offered unexpectedly. "Yes," Metrodora agreed. "Did you pray for something?" Yulia nodded. "For my uncle to find me." Metrodora suppressed her instinct to discourage such hope. Faith and fantasy often provided the only effective comfort available. "The gods hear us," she said instead, "even when humans don't." Upon their return, the brothel had already received its first clients of the day. The brief respite from their commercial purpose ended, and the women resumed their roles, carrying whatever spiritual solace they had found back into the relentless cycle of their daily existence. The confined nature of brothel life created intense relationships among its inhabitants. The women lived in extraordinary proximity, sharing limited space, resources, and common experiences that outsiders could rarely comprehend. These conditions fostered bonds that range from deep friendship to bitter rivalry, sometimes simultaneously. As midday approached, Metrodora sat with Thais and two other women during a brief meal break. Their conversation moved between practical matters and personal confidences, with the easy familiarity of those who have few secrets from each other by necessity. "My regular client, the merchant, says he's considering buying my contract," Thais revealed, her voice carefully neutral despite the significance of this possibility. Such news generated complex reactions. If true, it might represent significant improvement in Thais's circumstances. Private ownership often meant less frequent sexual use and better material conditions. Yet it could equally lead to more isolated abuse without the minimal protection that numbers sometimes provided in the brothel. "Has he mentioned it to Demetria?" asked Chloe, the older woman who often provided medical assistance to the others. "Not yet. He says he's still considering." "Don't hope too much," Chloe advised gently. "Men say many things in those moments." This wisdom, hard-earned through years of disappointments, was shared without cruelty. The women helped each other maintain the delicate balance between hope and realism necessary for psychological survival. Romantic relationships between prostitutes were not uncommon, though they had to be conducted with discretion. Roman society viewed female homosexuality with varying degrees of disapproval or disbelief. But within the brothel, such connections offered rare experiences of intimacy not defined by transaction or exploitation. Metrodora had observed the growing closeness between Lucia and a newer woman from Hispania. Their affection manifested in small gestures, saved portions of food, whispered conversations, the subtle positioning of their bodies to maintain contact during the limited time they shared. She recognized in their interaction something genuine amid so much that was performative. Male-female relationships within the brothel context were more complicated. The guards and other male slaves occupied ambiguous positions, sometimes protectors, sometimes exploiters themselves. Primus, the senior guard, maintained professional distance from most of the women, but had developed a relationship with Nevolia that included bringing her occasional gifts and ensuring she received less difficult clients when possible. Whether such arrangements constituted genuine affection or merely strategic alliances remained open to interpretation. In an environment where everyone's survival depended on navigating power dynamics effectively, pure motives were rare luxuries. More common than internal romances were attachments to regular clients. Despite the fundamentally commercial nature of these interactions, human connections sometimes developed within their confines. Some clients visited the same woman for years, bringing small gifts, sharing conversations about their lives, and occasionally developing feelings they themselves might not have anticipated. Lucius says he's saved almost enough, Metrodora told Thais when they were alone. Another year, perhaps. Thais regarded her skeptically. You believe he'll actually purchase your freedom? Metrodora shrugged. Probably not, but he believes it. And that keeps him kind, keeps him coming back. Sometimes the story matters more than whether it will ever end as promised. Such pragmatism characterized many prostitutes' approach to client relationships. Hope was balanced against experience, and even acknowledged false promises could provide real benefits in the present. For some women, children created the most significant relationships in their lives, complicated though these often were by their circumstances. Pregnancies resulting from commercial sex created numerous difficulties. The children might be claimed by brothel owners as potential future workers or servants, sold to other owners, or in rare cases, kept by their mothers if arrangements could be made for their care. Chloe had managed this last, rarest outcome. Her son, now 10 years old, lived with a former prostitute who had gained her freedom and established a small seamstress business. Chloe contributed what little she could save from occasional gifts toward his upkeep, and was permitted to visit him monthly, a privilege she guarded fiercely. He's learning to read, she told Metrodora proudly after her most recent visit. The woman who cares for him says he's clever with numbers too. The unspoken hope behind such achievements was clear. Education might provide him opportunities beyond those his mother had known. For many prostitutes, children represented both their greatest vulnerability and their most profound motivation to endure. As the day progressed, these various relationships provided both comfort and complexity. When a particularly difficult client left Lucia bruised and fighting tears, the Hispanian woman quietly attended to her, applying cool cloths to the marks and murmuring reassurances. When Yulia received her first client who paid for extended time, Metrodora managed to check on her afterward, bringing a special salve and practical advice delivered with compassion. These connections, forged in shared hardship, constituted a vital survival mechanism. In a world that reduced them to commodities, their relationships with each other affirmed their humanity. The rigid control systems of Roman brothels could not entirely eliminate individual agency. Despite their highly constrained circumstances, prostitutes found various ways to assert some degree of control over their lives and work. Small acts of resistance occurred daily. Women developed signals to warn each other about dangerous clients. They created hiding places for personal possessions and small amounts of money. They shared knowledge about contraception, abortion, and treatment for various ailments, maintaining some authority over their own bodies despite their commercial use. More overt resistance carried significant risks. Escape attempts rarely succeeded, and typically resulted in severe punishment, beating, branding, or being sold to worse establishments. Yet they continued to occur, testament to the human will for freedom even against overwhelming odds. They caught the girl from the brothel near the Forum, Primus mentioned casually, as he escorted Metrodora to the public bathhouse for the weekly washing permitted to the women. 3 days she was missing. They found her trying to board a ship to Sicily. Metrodora kept her expression neutral despite the tightening in her chest. What happened to her? What do you think? 20 lashes and sold to a mining camp brothel. Better if she drowned herself instead. Such cautionary tales served their intended purpose of discouraging similar attempts. Yet each new generation of brothel workers included some who believed their outcome might be different. Less dramatic, but potentially more effective, were the small ways women exercised choice within their prescribed roles. Some specialized in particular services that reduced their overall client numbers. Others cultivated regular customers whose preferences they could anticipate and manage. Many developed strategies to abbreviate encounters or redirect clients toward less physically demanding activities. Metrodora had perfected several such techniques. She had learned that engaging clients in conversation about themselves often shortened the physical portion of their visit while increasing their satisfaction with the overall experience. She had developed methods to appear to comply with rough treatment while subtly minimizing actual harm. She had cultivated relationships with key staff members who might intervene if necessary. "The merchant is asking for you again," Demetria informed her. "He's paid for 2 hours and brought gifts. Make sure he leaves satisfied." Such preferences from wealthy clients offered opportunities for slightly better treatment. The merchant, a middle-aged Syrian named Malchus, who traded in textiles, had visited Metrodora several times over the past months. He seemed to enjoy speaking Greek with her as much as the physical services, and his gifts, a small pot of honey, a length of finer cloth than she usually wore, occasionally a few extra coins slipped directly to her, made their encounters more tolerable than most. "I'm traveling to Alexandria next month," he told her during this visit. "I'll bring you something special when I return." Metrodora had learned to moderate her reactions to such promises. Some clients genuinely returned with gifts. Others used future generosity as a low-cost way to ensure enthusiastic current service. Either way, maintaining the relationship served her interests. "I would like that," she replied, adding just enough warmth to seem genuine without the excessive flattery that sophisticated clients found suspicious. More significant than these small negotiations were the ways some women managed to leverage their position for longer-term advantage. The path from brothel worker to independent courtesan was narrow and difficult, but not entirely closed. Those who combined beauty with intelligence, social skills, and considerable luck might eventually secure patrons who would purchase their freedom and establish them in private quarters where they could select their own clients. Nevolia had been working toward this goal for years, carefully cultivating relationships with wealthier men and saving what coins she could hide from Demetria's accounting. Her strategic approach, selecting potential benefactors, learning their preferences, making herself valuable beyond sexual services, demonstrated remarkable business acumen developed despite her circumstances. "Agrippina started exactly where we are," she reminded the other women occasionally. "Now she wears silk and chooses who touches her." Such examples kept hope alive, though the reality remained that most prostitutes would never achieve such transformation of their circumstances. For every woman who managed to leave brothel work for a better position, countless others remained trapped until age or illness rendered them unprofitable, at which point their options narrowed to begging, basic labor if their health permitted, or death from disease or exposure. Against these odds, the persistence of resistance, both small and large, revealed the indomitable aspects of human dignity. Despite systems designed to reduce them to commodities, the women of Rome's brothels maintained their humanity through countless daily acts of self-assertion, mutual protection, and persistent hope. The brutal economics of Roman prostitution created a professional lifespan that was typically short and followed a predictable downward trajectory. Youth and beauty commanded the highest prices and most desirable positions, with each passing year generally reducing a woman's value in the commercial sexual marketplace. Chloe, at 34, represented the exception rather than the rule. Most women her age had already been moved from formal brothels to the lowest tiers of street prostitution, servicing the poorest clients in doorways or alleys for minimal payment. Her continued presence in a mid-tier establishment stemmed from skills developed out of necessity. Her knowledge of medicinal treatments, her ability to train newer women, and her relationship with the brothel owner's wife, who valued her discretion regarding the owner's occasional visits to his own establishment. The trick to surviving, she told Metrodora as they prepared remedies together, is to make yourself useful beyond what happens on that bed. Men will always prefer younger bodies, but they sometimes value other things if you're clever enough to show them. This wisdom represented hard-earned knowledge about navigating a system designed to discard women once their prime earning years passed. The hierarchy of Roman prostitution relegated aging women to progressively worse conditions unless they secured rare alternatives. On this particular day, Chloe's advice took on immediate relevance. Demetria summoned ties to her small office at the back of the establishment, and the woman returned looking pale but composed. "The Dominus is selling me," she informed Metrodora quietly when they had a moment alone. "Not to the merchant, to the bathhouse near the Aventine." This news represented the first downward step that many women experienced. Bathhouse prostitution generally meant higher client volume, lower prices, and worse conditions than even modest brothels provided. Women typically serviced clients in the changing rooms or shadowed corners of the facility, with minimal privacy and rapid turnover. "Did you speak to Nevolia?" Metrodora asked. Her patron might. Tai shook her head. "Already tried. He's not interested in another woman right now." She attempted a smile that failed to reach her eyes. "At least it's not street work yet." This pragmatic acceptance characterized many prostitutes' approach to their inevitable professional decline. Each downward move was measured against worse possibilities, creating a gradual adjustment to deteriorating circumstances that made each step seem momentarily bearable. For the fortunate few, aging brought different possibilities. Later that day, as evening clients began to arrive, Agrippina visited again, this time accompanied by a well-dressed older woman, whom she introduced as Domitia. "She's looking for a house manager," Agrippina explained to Demetria. "Someone who knows the business but is past the age for regular work." Domitia, a wealthy widow who owns several properties, including a high-class brothel catering to senators and equities, examined the establishment with the sharp eye of an experienced businesswoman. "I need someone who can maintain records, manage girls, and handle difficult clients diplomatically," she stated. "Preferably literate, definitely experienced." This represented one of the rare upward transitions available to aging prostitutes, management positions within the same industry that had exploited them. Former prostitutes who developed administrative skills could sometimes secure roles as madams, housekeepers, or trainers in brothels, using their intimate knowledge of the business from the inside to operate it from a position of relative power. As Domitia conducted her business with Demetria, Metrodora observed the interaction with keen interest. Though still young enough to command decent prices, she recognized that her own future would eventually require similar transitions if she hoped to avoid the worst outcomes of aging in her profession. The oldest women in the sexual marketplace occupied its most marginal positions. Outside the brothel's entrance, an elderly woman occasionally positioned herself, offering the cheapest services to clients who couldn't afford even the modest prices of the established business. Her face deeply lined, her body showing the cumulative damage of decades in the profession, she represented the fate many brothel workers feared most. "She worked here before I arrived," Chloe had told Metrodora when she first noticed the woman. "Managed to buy her freedom but had no family, no other skills. Freedom means little when starvation is the alternative." This stark reality shaped how prostitutes viewed their future. Unlike many occupations where experience brought increased status and compensation, theirs operated in reverse. This knowledge created urgency around securing alternatives before their commercial value diminished beyond viability. For women like Nevolia, this meant intensifying efforts to secure patronage while still young enough to attract it. For others like Chloe, it meant developing skills valuable beyond sexual services. For many, it simply meant surviving long enough to accumulate the price of their own freedom, then hoping to find some other means of sustenance before their savings disappeared. As night fell on the brothel, the age-stratified nature of the work became particularly visible. Younger women received multiple clients, their youth still marketable despite the physical toll it took. Middle-aged women like Chloe received fewer visitors but performed additional duties to maintain their position. And in the shadows outside, the elderly woman waited for clients no one else would accept. The final stage in a profession that consumed women's bodies until nothing commercially valuable remained. The following morning brought an unexpected disruption to the brothel's routine. A group of public slaves accompanied by a minor official arrived to conduct an inspection, part of the periodic oversight that reminded brothel owners that their businesses, while legal, operated under certain constraints. "Tax assessment," the official announced importantly, producing a wax tablet and stylus. "I need to verify your registered workers and ensure appropriate taxes are being paid." Roman law maintained an ambivalent relationship with prostitution. The practice was legal and regulated, with prostitutes required to register with aediles, officials who oversaw markets and public buildings, and pay taxes on their earnings. Yet those same laws marked sex workers with permanent infamia, moral disgrace that limited their legal rights and excluded them from many aspects of civic life. As the official moved through the establishment, recording names and confirming identities against previous registrations, Demetria maintained a deferential demeanor that contrasted sharply with her usual authoritarian management style. Even legitimate businesses that catered to physical appetites occupied a precarious position in Roman society, requiring careful navigation of both formal regulations and informal expectations. "And this one?" the official questioned, pointing to Yulia, who was not on his list. "Recent acquisition," Demetria explained smoothly. "I was planning to register her at the next assessment period." The official frowned. "She should have been registered immediately. There will be a fine." This interaction highlighted the complex legal framework surrounding Roman prostitution. While the state sanctioned and taxed the trade, it simultaneously maintained mechanisms that kept it somewhat hidden from respectable society, and ensured that its practitioners remained firmly outside the protection of full citizenship. The infamia that attached to prostitutes carried significant legal consequences. They could not make wills or receive inheritances. They could not give evidence in court. They could not marry citizens, though this prohibition was sometimes circumvented. Even if they managed to leave the profession, the stain of having been registered as a prostitute remained legally permanent, though social enforcement of these restrictions varied in practice. After the official departed, having collected a substantial fine and updated his records, Demetria gathered the women briefly. "The dominus will expect us to make up the cost of that fine," she informed them. "Everyone works extended hours for the next week, no breaks except for meals." Such economic pressures illuminated how legal structures primarily protected the state's financial interest in prostitution rather than the women themselves. The tax system extracted wealth from their labor, while the legal restrictions ensured they remained vulnerable and exploitable. Beyond formal legal status, prostitutes occupied a complex position in Roman social imagination. Literary sources from the period reveal profoundly contradictory attitudes: fascination alongside disgust, desire alongside moral condemnation. In poetry and satire, prostitutes appeared variously as objects of desire, symbols of moral decay, clever manipulators, or pitiful victims. Ovid advised young men on how to navigate relationships with prostitutes in his Art of Love, while moralists like Juvenal used the prevalence of prostitution as evidence of Rome's decline from earlier virtue. These contradictions extended to religious and social contexts. During certain festivals, prostitutes participated in public religious ceremonies, temporarily incorporated into mainstream activities from which they were otherwise excluded. The Floralia festival even featured public performances by prostitutes, creating a sanctioned space for the display of sexuality otherwise kept somewhat confined to designated areas. Yet these periodic inclusions did not fundamentally alter their marginal status. Roman society maintained strict categories of respectable and non-respectable women, with prostitutes firmly established in the latter. The bright clothing and distinctive makeup they were legally required to wear served as visual markers of this separation, ensuring no confusion between matrons and meretrices, prostitutes. For the women themselves, navigating this contradictory social position required careful attention to context and boundaries. When venturing into public spaces, they adopted behaviors appropriate to their status, neither pretending to respectability nor performing their professional personas too explicitly outside designated areas. As evening approached, and the brothel prepared for its busiest hours, a different kind of visitor arrived. A wealthy matron's litter stopped briefly outside, and her steward entered to make discreet arrangements. "My domina is hosting a dinner party tonight," he explained to Demetria. "Her husband has requested entertainment afterward for his male guests. 4 girls, the most cultured you have, for conversation and companionship only at first. What happens in private chambers later is separate." Such arrangements were common among the elite, who maintained public adherence to moral standards while privately incorporating prostitutes into their entertainment. For the women selected, Metrodora among them, due to her education and languages, such assignments could bring better treatment and generous tips, though the fundamental nature of the transaction remained unchanged. As Metrodora prepared for this assignment, applying more subtle makeup and donning less revealing clothing than her usual brothel attire, she reflected on the contradictions of a society that both condemned and consumed women like her. The same senators who might publicly support laws restricting prostitution would privately employ her services. The same matrons who would avoid her on the street might hire her to entertain their husbands' guests. These contradictions created not just legal and social challenges, but profound psychological ones. Navigating a world that simultaneously demanded and despised them required prostitutes to develop complex internal mechanisms for understanding their place within it. Mechanisms that allowed them to maintain some sense of self-worth despite society's contradictory messages. The luxurious villa on the Esquiline Hill presented a stark contrast to the cramped confines of the brothel. As Metrodora and 3 other women were led through its spacious atrium by household slaves, the wealth on display, marble floors, elaborate wall paintings, bronze and silver decorative items, highlighted the vast economic disparities that characterized Roman society. The dinner party was ending as they arrived. Male guests reclined on couches in the triclinium, while slaves cleared away the remains of elaborate dishes. The host, a middle-aged senator named Quintus Caelius, greeted them with the casual entitlement of a man accustomed to purchasing whatever he desired. "Ah, our entertainment has arrived," he announced to his guests. "Come, girls, show these gentlemen that beauty and intellect can sometimes exist together in the female form." This setting, far from the brothel, but still fundamentally commercial, illustrated the economic structures that defined prostitution across all its various forms. Whether operating in a brothel cell for 2 asses per client, or accompanying wealthy men at private gatherings for substantially higher fees, the underlying transaction remained the sale of female sexuality and companionship to meet male demand. The economic organization of Roman prostitution operated at multiple levels. At the bottom, street prostitutes worked independently or under the control of pimps serving the poorest clients for minimal fees. Above them, brothel workers like Metrodora operated within established businesses with fixed locations and prices. Higher still were private courtesan-type prostitutes who maintained their own residences and selected their clients. At the top, a small elite of heterae might secure long-term arrangements with wealthy patrons, sometimes achieving significant financial security. This hierarchy reflected broader economic stratification in Roman society. The wealth that allowed men like Caelius to casually spend on sexual entertainment derived from the same systems of slavery, conquest, and unequal resource distribution that often drove women into prostitution in the first place. As the evening progressed, the economic nature of the interaction remained present despite its more refined setting. When one of the senator's guests expressed particular interest in Metrodora, negotiations occurred not with her, but between the man and Demetria, who had accompanied the women to manage financial arrangements. The price agreed upon, 50 denarii for exclusive access for the remainder of the night, represented more than most prostitutes earned in a month. Yet Metrodora would receive only a tiny fraction as a tip if the client proved generous. The brothel owner, Marcus Lucius Fronto, collected the majority of Metrodora's earnings. His investment in purchasing her years earlier had long since been recovered many times over, yet she remained his property, generating ongoing profit with minimal additional cost to him. This economic reality, the extraordinary return on investment that sex slaves represented, explained why prostitution remained a favored business venture for those with capital to invest. For brothel owners, the calculation was straightforward. A female slave purchased young could generate income for at least 10 to 15 years, before her decreasing value might necessitate selling her to a lower establishment. During that time, her earnings might multiply her purchase price by 10 or more, depending on her attributes and the establishment's clientele. These calculations remained invisible to the wealthy men at the dinner party, who viewed the women's presence as simply another luxury their position afforded them. As wine flowed and the evening progressed toward its inevitable conclusion, the conversation turned briefly to business matters. "My shipping investment has returned 30% this year," one man boasted. Nothing compares to the eastern trade routes. Impressive, another replied, though my urban properties have performed nearly as well with far less risk. The rental market near the Forum is extraordinarily profitable. Neither mentioned what both understood: that human merchandise often offered the highest returns of all, particularly when that merchandise could be used repeatedly without significant depreciation for years before being sold to recover some portion of the initial investment. For the women temporarily present in this wealth, the contrast with their daily existence could prove both tantalizing and painful. Metrodora observed the comfortable furnishings, the abundant food, the seemingly effortless luxury, knowing that her labor contributed to similar comforts for others, while she herself would return to a stone bed in a windowless cell. As the party broke into smaller groups and the guests began leading their chosen companions to private rooms, Metrodora accompanied the man who had paid for her services, an older equess, knight visiting from northern Italy. In his temporary chamber, despite the luxurious surroundings, the fundamental transaction differed little from those conducted in her brothel cell. The primary distinctions were the comfort of the bed and the absence of another client waiting immediately afterward. When dawn approached and the women were collected to return to the brothel, the economic machinery resumed its normal operation. Demetria counted the money received, recorded the amounts in her tablets, and set aside the small portions that would be given to the women as tips. The majority would go to Fronto, with Demetria receiving her percentage for arranging the lucrative assignment. This distribution of profits reflected the broader economic power structures within which prostitution operated. Those with the least power, the women whose bodies were being sold, received the smallest share of the wealth they generated. Those who controlled access to them, brothel owners, madams, pimps, extracted the majority of the value while assuming minimal personal risk or discomfort. As they walked back through streets now coming alive with morning activity, Metrodora calculated that the previous night's work by the four of them had generated enough income to purchase a small farm, a fact that highlighted the fundamental economic injustice of their position. The value their bodies created built wealth for others, while they themselves remained property rather than property owners. This economic reality explained why, despite the physical and psychological costs of the profession, prostitution persisted as a substantial industry in Roman society. For those with capital to invest, few business ventures offered comparable returns with similar stability of demand. For the women caught within this system, economic consciousness did not require formal education. They understood precisely how their bodies generated wealth and exactly how little of that wealth they were permitted to retain. This knowledge informed their constant calculations and strategies, their efforts to secure tips, cultivate profitable regulars, hide small amounts from official accounting, and position themselves for less exploitative arrangements whenever possible. As they reached the brothel, already receiving its first morning clients, Demetria handed each woman her portion of the night's earnings, a few denarii that represented a tiny fraction of what their services had cost. "Get some rest," she instructed. "Regular work resumes at midday." The economic machine continued its operation, converting female sexuality into male pleasure and, more importantly, converting both into profit for those who controlled the means of this particular production. The morning after the private party, Metrodora felt the physical consequences of her profession more acutely than usual. The wealthy client had not been particularly rough, but the extended hours and lack of rest had left her body depleted. Like most women in her position, She had developed a repertoire of practices to maintain her physical functioning despite the demands placed upon it. In the small washing area behind the kitchen, she began her restorative routine. A mixture of vinegar and water first to cleanse and reduce inflammation in her genital area. Then a salve containing olive oil, beeswax, and herbs applied to irritated skin. Finally, a careful inspection for any signs of the diseases that constituted occupational hazards. "Here," said Chloe, appearing beside her with a small cup. "Drink this, it will help with the pain." The bitter concoction, a mixture of willow bark, feverfew, and other ingredients Chloe kept secret, provided some relief from the physical discomfort that was their constant companion. Such remedies, passed from woman to woman rather than prescribed by physicians, constituted a parallel medical tradition developed through necessity. Physical maintenance extended beyond treating immediate discomfort. The women had developed various strategies to minimize damage during their work. Some inserted sea sponges soaked in vinegar or acidic fruit juices before clients, believing these might reduce disease transmission and prevent pregnancy. Others applied olive oil or animal fat as lubricants to reduce tearing and irritation during frequent intercourse. Most developed techniques to limit physical exertion without clients noticing, preserving energy through subtle positioning adjustments. Diet played a crucial role in maintaining their health, though they had limited control over what they consumed. The brothel provided basic sustenance: beans, grain porridge, occasional vegetables, and watered wine. Whenever possible, the women supplemented this with foods believed to maintain strength and appearance: eggs when available, honey for energy, certain herbs thought to promote health or prevent conception. "Eat," Chloe instructed, placing a small piece of honeycomb beside Metrodora. "You'll need your strength. Demetria says we're all working extended hours until the tax fine is recovered." This shared knowledge about bodily maintenance represented one of the most important forms of resistance available to brothel workers: the determination to preserve their physical selves as much as possible despite their commercial use. By developing and sharing strategies for health maintenance, the women asserted a form of ownership over bodies that legally belonged to others. Physical appearance required particular attention, as it directly affected earning potential. Hair was oiled and styled in fashionable arrangements, with wealthy brothels sometimes employing dedicated ornatrices, hairstylists, for this purpose. In smaller establishments like Metrodora's, the women assisted each other, recreating as best they could the elaborate styles worn by fashionable Roman women. "Hold still," Thais instructed as she arranged Metrodora's dark hair in a series of carefully placed curls. This style is popular with the Equites right now. Nyavolia says her patron specifically requested it. Teeth were cleaned with tooth powder made from various abrasive substances, and sometimes strengthened with urine mouthwash, a common Roman practice despite its unpleasantness. Skin was maintained with various creams and treatments, though years of heavy makeup application often took a permanent toll, creating the distinctive appearance that identified older prostitutes, even when not working. Exercise, while not formally structured, became incorporated into daily activities. Some women practiced dance movements during quiet periods, maintaining flexibility that served both performance purposes and physical health. Others developed subtle strengthening routines that could be performed in the limited space of their cells, preserving muscle tone that helped them endure their work's physical demands. Sleep, perhaps the most essential element of physical maintenance, remained the most elusive. The brothel's operating hours left limited time for rest, and what time was available often came in fragmented periods, interrupted by nightmares, noise, or unscheduled clients. Many women develop the ability to fall asleep quickly whenever opportunity presented, a survival skill that allowed them to accumulate enough rest to function despite irregular patterns. As midday approached and Metrodora prepared to resume regular work, she completed her physical preparation with practiced efficiency. Fresh makeup applied to cover signs of fatigue, hair checked and adjusted, scented oil rubbed on pulse points to mask any lingering body odor. A final assessment in the small, polished metal disc that served as her mirror. "You look tired," Demetria observed critically as Metrodora took her place in the receiving area. "Try to appear more animated. Clients don't pay for exhaustion." This command illustrated the fundamental challenge of maintaining physical health in prostitution, the necessity of appearing energetic and enthusiastic, regardless of actual physical condition. The performance of desire and pleasure constituted an essential part of the service being sold, requiring significant physical and emotional energy beyond the sexual acts themselves. As her first afternoon client arrived, a regular, thankfully, who preferred brief, predictable encounters, Metrodora drew upon years of experience to present the required facade despite her body's protests. This ability to override physical discomfort for economic necessity represented perhaps the most fundamental survival skill her profession demanded. While physical survival strategies were visible and sometimes shared openly among prostitutes, psychological adaptations often developed more privately, forming internal protective mechanisms that allowed women to endure their circumstances while preserving some core sense of self. As afternoon clients came and went, Metrodora employed one of her most effective psychological techniques, mental displacement. While her body remained present and responsive in the small cell, performing whatever was required, her mind traveled elsewhere, to memories of childhood in Greece, to stories she had read in stolen moments, to elaborate fantasies of future freedom. This separation between physical experience and mental presence allowed her to limit the psychological impact of activities she could not physically avoid. Different women developed different strategies. Lucia, with her musical background, often repeated songs silently during difficult encounters, focusing on remembering lyrics and melodies rather than her immediate circumstances. Novolia had perfected a form of commercial persona, a character she inhabited during work hours that absorbed client interactions while protecting what she considered her true self. "The trick," she once explained to newer women, "is to decide what parts of yourself belong to them and what parts remain yours alone. Give them the body, the smiles, the words they want to hear. Keep your thoughts, your feelings, your true reactions as private property they haven't purchased." This psychological compartmentalization represented sophisticated adaptive behavior developed through necessity. By creating boundaries between their commercial selves and their private identities, many prostitutes maintained mental health that might otherwise have been destroyed by their experiences. Other psychological strategies operated more communally. The women developed shared narratives that reframed their circumstances in more tolerable terms. Some emphasized their economic function, viewing themselves as providers of a service rather than as objects of use. Others focused on their superiority to clients in various ways, their greater emotional intelligence, their ability to manipulate men's desires, their clearer understanding of the transactional nature of all human relationships. "They may own our bodies," Chloe often remarked, "but we understand their weaknesses better than their own wives do." There's power in that knowledge. Whether such narratives represented genuine belief or necessary self-deception remained difficult to distinguish even for the women themselves. The boundary between protective psychological adaptation and damaging self-delusion proved thin and permeable. Religion provided another psychological resource, offering frameworks for understanding suffering and maintaining hope despite present circumstances. Many prostitutes developed intensely personal relationships with various deities, finding in divine narratives explanations for their experiences and possibilities for future redemption. Humor, often dark and biting, served as yet another psychological survival mechanism. In private moments, the women shared jokes about clients' physical shortcomings, behavioral quirks, or hypocritical pretensions. This gallows humor provided emotional release, while reinforcing solidarity among those who truly understood their shared reality. As evening approached and client traffic increased, the psychological demands intensified. Each woman employed her particular adaptive strategies while navigating the complex requirements of their work, appearing simultaneously available and discriminating, sensual and innocent, experienced and fresh depending on each client's specific desires. For Metrodora, this evening brought particular challenges. A group of young men celebrating before one's wedding arrived, already intoxicated and rowdy. Such groups typically sought to demonstrate masculinity through degrading treatment of prostitutes, with individual members encouraging each other toward increasingly aggressive behavior. As she was selected by one of these men, Metrodora activated her most protective psychological mechanisms. Her body performed what was required, while her mind retreated to a carefully constructed internal sanctuary. A detailed imaginary garden, based on one from her childhood, elaborated over years of mental escape. Within this visualization, she could wander freely, while her physical self endured whatever was temporarily necessary. This sophisticated dissociation, while protective in the immediate situation, carried long-term psychological costs. Many prostitutes developed chronic difficulties reconnecting body and mind, experiencing emotional numbness that persisted beyond working hours. Some struggled to experience genuine pleasure or emotional intimacy, even in rare consensual encounters, their protective mechanisms having become too deeply ingrained to easily deactivate. Later that night, as the brothel finally quieted and the women retreated to their cells for brief rest, the psychological toll became visible in various ways. Lucia silently wept despite her usual stoicism. Nevolia methodically counted and recounted her hidden coins, the concrete symbol of future escape providing temporary comfort. Yulia, the newest arrival, stared vacantly at her wall, her previous identity visibly eroding as protective adaptations began to form. Metrodora engaged in her own nightly ritual of psychological maintenance. From her hidden cache of treasures, she removed the small scroll of poetry Lucius had given her. Reading by dim lamplight, she temporarily inhabited a world of beauty and meaning entirely separate from her daily reality. This brief immersion in literature, in ideas and images created purely for their emotional and intellectual impact rather than commercial value, allowed her to reconnect with aspects of herself that her work environment neither recognized nor required. These various psychological strategies, both individual and collective, enabled survival within circumstances that might otherwise have proven unbearable. The human mind's remarkable adaptability, its capacity to create protective mechanisms against overwhelming stress, allowed these women to endure conditions that their society considered appropriate for those of their status. Yet adaptation itself exacted costs. The very psychological mechanisms that enabled daily functioning often created difficulties that persisted beyond the brothel's walls. Former prostitutes frequently reported struggles with intimacy, trust, emotional regulation, and self-concept that continued long after they left the profession. The psychological armor necessary for survival proved difficult to remove, even when its protection was no longer required. As Metrodora finally allowed herself to drift towards sleep, her carefully maintained psychological boundaries temporarily relaxed. In this vulnerable state, between wakefulness and dreams, emotions she had controlled throughout the day briefly surfaced. Grief, anger, longing, fear, before exhaustion pulled her into unconsciousness. Tomorrow would require the same protective mechanisms, the same separation between experiencing self and observing self, the same careful preservation of an inner core that remained, however tenuously, her own. The following day brought an unexpected visitor to the brothel. During the quiet, late afternoon period, a middle-aged woman dressed in the modest clothing of a respectable freedwoman arrived, asking to speak with Demetria. After a brief private conversation, Demetria summoned Metrodora to her small office. "This is Valeria," Demetria explained with uncharacteristic formality. "She represents a client who wishes to discuss purchasing your contract." This moment, the potential transition from one owner to another, represented one of the few junctures where a prostitute's circumstances might significantly change. Such transfers occurred for various reasons: a regular client developing particular attachment, a madam seeking specific talents for a higher class establishment, a wealthy household requiring a concubine with certain attributes. Valeria assessed Metrodora with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating a commercial asset. "My dominus has been pleased with your services on his visits," she stated. "He's considering a more permanent arrangement. He has questions about your background and abilities." What followed was essentially a job interview conducted within the constraints of slavery. Metrodora's Greek education, her languages, her health history, and her general deportment all received scrutiny. The potential purchaser, represented by his household manager, sought value beyond the immediate sexual services that constituted her current commercial purpose. This interaction illustrated one of the limited pathways through which prostitutes might potentially improve their circumstances. Direct purchase by a private client could represent significant advancement, potentially reducing the number of men she would be required to service, improving her material conditions, and possibly creating opportunities for eventual manumission, freedom. "My dominus will consider the matter further," Valeria concluded. "If he decides to proceed, he will contact your owner directly." After she departed, Metrodora returned to her regular duties, careful not to display excessive hope or excitement about this possibility. Experience had taught most brothel residents to moderate their expectations regarding potential improvements in their circumstances. Many such inquiries came to nothing, and visible eagerness for escape could anger Demetria, who might then sabotage arrangements out of spite. Later that evening, as several women gathered during a brief meal break, conversation turned to the various pathways out of brothel life that they had witnessed or heard about during their years in the profession. "My first year here, there was a woman named Dionysia," Chloe recalled. "A merchant bought her contract, took her to Alexandria as his concubina. She sent a message once through a sailor who visited. Said she had her own room in his house and only served him." "Better than here," Lucia observed, but still owned. Novolia, always focused on more ambitious outcomes, described a different pathway. "The best route is saving enough to buy your own freedom, then establishing independent practice with a better class of clients. That's how Agrippina did it." This strategy, prostitutes purchasing their own freedom, represented a rare but actual pathway out of enslaved brothel work. In Roman law, slaves could possess a peculium, money or property that legally belonged to their owner, but which they were permitted to control and potentially use to purchase their manumission. For prostitutes, this typically required years of concealing portions of tips or gifts from accounting, saving tiny amounts that eventually might accumulate to the necessary sum. Freedom costs at least 2,000 denarii for someone our age, Nevolia continued, the specific figure indicating how precisely she had researched this possibility. More if you're particularly profitable for your owner. This astronomical sum, representing years of a laborer's wages, highlighted the economic barriers to self-purchase. Given that most prostitutes received only small portions of their earnings as personal tips, accumulating such amounts required extraordinary discipline, secrecy, and luck. There are other ways, offered Thais quietly. Religious conversion sometimes. This referenced another potential pathway. Certain religious organizations occasionally purchased prostitutes' freedom as charitable acts. The emerging Christian communities sometimes engaged in such practices, viewing the redemption of sex workers as spiritually significant. Other mystery religions occasionally incorporated similar acts of liberation into their practices, though usually with expectations of religious service afterward. Marriage provided another theoretical pathway, though one rarely available to brothel slaves. While Roman men could not legally marry women of prostitute status, former prostitutes who had obtained their freedom could potentially marry men of lower social classes or non-citizens. Such marriages rarely elevated them to respectability, but could provide economic partnership and protection. My cousin married a Syrian trader, Lucia shared. Former street worker, managed to save enough to buy her freedom. His business isn't much, selling lamps near the Sabora, but they live in 2 rooms above the shop. She helps with the business. Such rare success stories circulated among brothel workers, providing templates for possible futures that sustained hope despite the overwhelming odds against such outcomes. For every woman who secured a more favorable arrangement, countless others remained trapped within the system until age rendered them unprofitable, at which point their options narrowed dramatically. The oldest former prostitutes often faced the grimmest prospects. Without family support or savings, many ended their lives in extreme poverty, begging or selling sexual services at the lowest prices to the poorest clients. Some managed to secure positions as servants in bathhouses, inns, or taverns, their former profession having provided skills in customer service if nothing else. A fortunate few might be retained by brothel owners as cooks, cleaners, or trainers of younger women, their knowledge of the business offsetting their diminished commercial value. As this conversation about potential futures continued, Demetria appeared in the doorway. "Enough idle talk," she snapped. "Clients are waiting." The women dispersed to their assigned places, their brief consideration of possible escape routes replaced by the immediate demands of their current reality. Yet the knowledge of these potential pathways, however narrow and difficult, provided essential psychological sustenance. In a system designed to eliminate hope, the mere awareness that others had occasionally found exits represented a form of resistance against complete despair. 3 months after the visit from Valeria, Metrodora stood in the brothel's small receiving area, her few possessions bundled in a cloth. The negotiations had been lengthy and complex, but finally concluded. Her contract had been purchased by Lucius Antonius Sabinus, the client represented by Valeria. She would leave the brothel today to join his household as a concubina, a position with its own constraints and expectations, but generally offering better conditions than brothel work. "Remember what I told you," Nevolia advised quietly as they said their farewells. "Guard whatever freedoms you gain. Save whatever you can hide. trust no promises until they're fulfilled. This hard-earned wisdom reflected the reality that transitions from brothel to private household, while potentially improving immediate circumstances, rarely led to complete liberation. The fundamental power dynamics remained. She would still be property, still sexually obligated, still legally vulnerable. Yet, the reduction in physical demands, the increased material comfort, and the possibility of eventually securing her freedom made this change significant despite its limitations. As Metrodora prepared to depart, a rare moment of transition within a world where daily existence typically unfolded with relentless sameness, the lives she was leaving behind continued their established patterns. Chloe prepared remedies for common ailments. Lucia entertained a regular client with the songs from her homeland that he particularly enjoyed. Nevolia calculated her savings and planned her eventual independence. Yulia, no longer the newest arrival, showed a recently purchased girl how to apply makeup that would cover bruises effectively. These daily activities, unremarkable to those performing them, invisible to the broader society benefiting from them, constituted the actual answer to the question of what Roman prostitutes did all day. Beyond the sexual transactions that defined their commercial purpose, existed complex networks of knowledge sharing, mutual support, psychological adaptation, and persistent hope that enabled survival within a system designed for exploitation. The women of Rome's brothels managed their bodies through detailed health practices developed through collective experience rather than formal medicine. They created psychological defense mechanisms that protected core aspects of identity despite commodification. They formed relationships that provided emotional sustenance within emotionally barren circumstances. They maintained awareness of potential escape routes despite overwhelming barriers to their achievement. They developed expertise in reading men's moods and desires, skills in diffusing potential violence, techniques for maximizing income and minimizing physical damage. They created their own hierarchies of status based on criteria different from those imposed by the outside world. They preserved cultural practices from their diverse origins, songs, stories, religious beliefs, within spaces designed to strip them of individual identity. Most fundamentally, they maintained their humanity in a system that defined them as objects rather than persons. Through countless daily acts of mutual care, shared knowledge, and personal resistance, they asserted the ineradicable personhood that their legal and social status attempted to deny. As Valeria arrived to escort Metrodora to her new household, final embraces were exchanged with the women who had been her community for 7 years. No grand farewells marked her departure. The brothel's business continued uninterrupted, with a new woman already assigned to her former cell. Yet as she walked away from the building that had contained so much of her adult life, Metrodora carried with her not just her small bundle of possessions, but the accumulated wisdom of this hidden world. Strategies for survival, techniques for preservation of self, and perhaps most importantly, the knowledge that even within systems of profound oppression, human dignity persists through countless daily acts of resistance, connection, and hope. The brothel's door closed behind her, and new clients continued to arrive, unaware of her departure or replacement. The business of commercial sexuality in ancient Rome continued its relentless operation, a vast, complex economic and social system built upon the bodies of women whose daily lives, beyond their sexual transactions, remained largely invisible to the society that simultaneously demanded and degraded them. Rome, 82 CE, 7 years later. The small shop near the Vicus Tuscus bustled with activity. Shelves displayed an array of imported cosmetics, perfumes, and medicinal preparations. The owner, a woman in her early 30s, dressed in the modest clothing of a successful freedwoman, directed two young assistants as they arranged new merchandise. "Place the Egyptian coal on the front display," Metrodora instructed, "and make sure the labels are clearly visible." 5 years had passed since she had gained her freedom. After 3 years as Lucius Antonius Sabinus's concubina, she had eventually secured her manumission through a combination of saved gifts, useful service, and his declining health, which had prompted him to free several slaves in his will. With a small inheritance he had left her, unusual but not unprecedented for a concubine who had provided years of satisfactory service, she had established this specialized shop catering to women's beauty needs. Her knowledge of cosmetics and medicinal preparations, developed during her years in the brothel, now served her as legitimate business expertise. The path from brothel to business ownership represented an exceptional outcome, achieved by perhaps one woman in thousands who entered prostitution. Metrodora's relative literacy, her multilingual abilities, her knowledge of specialized products, and most significantly, her remarkable luck in securing a beneficial patron, had all contributed to this rare trajectory. As she arranged her account tablets at the small desk near the back of the shop, a visitor arrived. Nevolia, now approaching 40, but still striking in appearance, and carrying herself with the confidence of a woman who had accomplished what few managed. She had not only secured her freedom, but established herself as an independent courtesan with her own small apartment and selective clientele. "Your new Egyptian shipment arrived, I see," Nevolia observed, examining the displayed items. "Save me some of the eye paint. My senator appreciates the exotic look." Their friendship, formed during shared years of exploitation, had endured through their divergent paths to freedom. Though operating in different spheres now, Metrodora in legitimate commerce, Nevolia in higher class but still stigmatized sex work, they maintained their connection, sharing business information and personal support. "Any word of the others?" Metrodora asked as she prepared tea for them in the shop's back room. "Chloe died last winter," Nevolia reported soberly. "The cough finally took her, but her son is doing well. Apprenticed to a carpenter now. She lived to see him established at least." Such outcomes, death from chronic ailments acquired during brothel years, small triumphs found in children's advancement, represented common endpoints for women who had served in Rome's sex trade. Few achieved the relative success that Metrodora and Nevolia had secured. "Thais is still at the bathhouse," Nevolia continued. "Aging, of course, but she's managed to transition to managing the other girls rather than working herself. Lucia disappeared. Rumor says she finally returned to Gaul, but no one knows for certain." As they shared this news of former colleagues, a woman entered the shop, hesitating at the threshold. Though dressed in a respectable stola, something in her manner, a certain wariness, a particular way of assessing the space and its occupants, marked her as someone familiar with marginalized existence. "Can I help you?" Metrodora inquired, moving toward the front of the shop. "I was told you might have a remedy," the woman began cautiously, "for women who work in certain professions, something to prevent conception." Understanding immediately, Metrodora nodded and moved to a shelf containing various preparations. "I have several options, depending on your specific needs." As she assembled various items, explaining their uses quietly, Metrodora maintained the woman's dignity through careful language and matter-of-fact treatment. This, too, represented a form of continuity with her past, using her knowledge to assist other women navigating difficult circumstances, providing information that formal medical channels often withheld from those of lower status. After the customer departed, Nevolia observed, "You get many of those, I imagine." More than you might expect, Metrodora confirmed. Women from the brothels, certainly, but also married women seeking to limit their families, widows involved with men not their husbands, even occasionally respectable matrons with reasons to avoid pregnancy. This continued connection to women's hidden needs, the management of sexuality beyond official social boundaries, characterized many former prostitutes who managed to establish independent lives. Their specialized knowledge, developed through necessity, often provided their most marketable skills in creating post-prostitution livelihoods. As evening approached and Metrodora prepared to close her shop, a young girl arrived with a message. A regular client of Nevolia's was seeking her services that evening. Duty calls, Nevolia remarked with the professional pragmatism that had helped her survive and eventually thrive. Same arrangement next week. I'll bring news from Agrippina's establishment. After her friend departed, Metrodora completed her closing routine, securing merchandise, counting the day's earnings, preparing records for the following morning. Her life now bore little outward resemblance to her years in the brothel, yet countless invisible threads connected her present circumstances to that formative experience. The knowledge that had made her valuable there, understanding of cosmetics, remedies, and human desires, now served her in legitimate business. The psychological resilience developed through exploitation now enabled her to navigate commercial challenges. The perspective gained through marginalization now informed her treatment of those who entered her shop bearing their own hidden burdens. As she walked through the early evening streets toward her modest but private apartment, Metrodora passed a brothel entrance where two young women stood, heavily made up and scantily dressed, calling invitations to passing men. Their youth and the rehearsed quality of their enticements suggested recent entry into the profession that she had left behind. She did not break stride or acknowledge them directly, no obvious recognition that might link her respectable present to the profession that would permanently mark anyone identified with it. Yet she noticed details invisible to most passers-by. The concealed bruise beneath carefully applied makeup, the slight wince as one shifted position, the practiced smile that never reached the eyes. In that moment of observation without interaction, Metrodora embodied the complex reality of prostitution in Roman society, the gulf between those trapped within it and those who had escaped it, the persistent connections despite social barriers, and most fundamentally, the humanity that remained intact despite systems designed to commodify it. The daily lives of Roman prostitutes, filled with physical management, psychological adaptation, economic calculation, social navigation, and stubborn preservation of self, remained largely invisible to the society that created and maintained the conditions of their existence. Yet within that hidden world existed the full complexity of human experience, suffering and resilience, exploitation and resistance, degradation and dignity. As Metrodora continued toward home, the young women returned to their practiced calls, and potential clients continued to evaluate their commercial appeal. The ancient business of sexuality continued its operation across the Eternal City, as it had for centuries before and would for centuries after, a fundamental aspect of Roman urban life, acknowledged in law, literature, and art, yet whose daily reality remained obscured behind closed doors, cultural assumptions, and social conventions that preferred the fantasy of prostitution to its complex humanity. What did Roman prostitutes actually do all day? They survived, they connected, they resisted, they adapted, they maintained, they were protected, they shared, they calculated, they waited, they hoped, they endured. And in doing so, they demonstrated the persistence of humanity even within systems designed to deny it, perhaps their most significant and least acknowledged daily achievement.